4 of Paul's letters are known as the prison epistles. We call them this because he makes reference in each of these letters to being under arrest while he's writing them. These 4 letters would be his letter to the church in Colossae, his letter to the church in Philippi, his letter to the church in Ephesus, and his letter to an individual, Philemon, dealing with the issue of Onesimus, a slave that used to belong to Philemon, but who has been on the run and somehow has been ministering to Paul during his prison stay. And so these 4 letters comprise the prison epistles, and it's very popular thinking for us to believe that he wrote these letters while he was under arrest waiting for his trial in Rome. But there's some other thoughts out there about when he might have written these letters, because Paul was under arrest on multiple different occasions. And so we have to begin to weigh the evidence. And N.T. Wright has an interesting theory that many other scholars also believe, but he has some great evidence for it. He believes that during Paul's 3rd missionary journey, Paul spent time under arrest in Ephesus. Now, there's no record of this. There's nothing in Acts that talks about an arrest and imprisonment in Ephesus of Paul. There's nothing where Paul specifically references being under arrest in Ephesus, and yet the evidence that N.T. Wright has is very compelling. For one thing, the letters that he writes where he talks about his imprisonment, he seems to be at a real physical threat for his life. He really seems like he thinks he is going to potentially die from this arrest, and he's in great distress. And he talks about it in such a way as though it wasn't his choice. And yet, when he was under arrest waiting his trial in Rome, he kind of chose it. He appealed to Caesar. He kind of knew he was going to be getting a free ride to Rome when he did that. And so it seems more likely that his arrest that he leads him to write these letters happened in a place where it wasn't expected, where he wasn't planning on it, and where he was really distraught about what was going on with him. Paul seems to reference something that happened to him in Ephesus in his letter to the Corinthians, his 2nd letter to the Corinthians, or at least what we call the 2nd letter to the Corinthians. And so he says that in Ephesus he wrestled with wild beasts. Now it's unlikely that he wrestled with real wild beasts, but was it a metaphor? Was it something about the people there that he wrestled with, that there was some kind of upheaval that ended up with him being arrested and having a kind of fight for his life in a way that would have been tantamount to fighting wild beasts? We also see that there's a strange thing about Paul's journey to Ephesus. In his 3rd missionary journey, he ends up going to Ephesus like he kind of wanted to do in his 2nd missionary journey, but the Spirit had stopped him from going there. But he stays there for some time, and he has, like we saw in the last video, some incredible success that happens there. And yet, when he makes his return from that journey, he does not go back to Ephesus. He doesn't visit there again. That's very unlike Paul. Paul would have taken every opportunity that he could to have revisited some of the churches, especially if he was going to be passing nearby, to strengthen them, to train new leaders, and to make sure that they were on track. And yet he doesn't go back to Ephesus ever again, as far as we know. So there was something that happened there that caused him to want to avoid that place. N.T. Wright believes that he experienced an imprisonment there that was around the idea of what was going on with the riots in Ephesus when he was ministering there. And that something happens that was a little less clear-cut. It wasn't so obvious that Paul wasn't guilty or that Paul was in some way being persecuted. There was a less clear-cut nature to this case that really caused some embarrassment to Paul, really caused some depression for Paul. And so Paul was deeply distraught when he wrote these letters, and we see him pretty crushed in his spirit. Now, Paul, in all of his letters, continually talks about wishing that his work was not in vain, that he was constantly checking up on the churches that he planted and the leaders that he had trained to make sure they were still following after Christ, because he wanted to make sure that the work that he had done was not done in vain, but that there was real fruit that was coming from his zeal and his suffering in the Lord. And yet when he writes these letters, these prison epistles, there's a deep mournfulness to them. There's a spirit change about Paul as he writes these letters. Another bit of evidence that N.T. Wright takes is if you look at the region, the area where Paul writes these letters to, it's not far from Ephesus. I mean, obviously the Ephesian church, the letter that would have been circulated in and around the area of Ephesus, that's very close to Ephesus, of course, but Philippi wasn't too far either, neither was Thessalonica. Remember, he had gone over the Aegean Sea, not far from there, just a couple hundred miles, to minister in his second missionary journey. And so it would have been more likely that if he was writing these letters from Ephesus, he would reference being able to come to them if he made it out of this alive. And indeed he does in his letters. He says that he's planning on going back and visiting these places. And so we see in Paul and in his letters that there's something deep that happened, and a real scarring, a real suffering that takes place around this issue of being arrested. I think we can all relate to that. There's times when each of us, even when we're doing what God calls us to and what we think exactly is being obedient to Christ, there's always times where it seems like there's some kind of failure or some kind of letdown or some kind of distress and suffering that comes into our lives that kind of crushes our spirit. And we see this in Paul in this place, and it really humanizes him for us. It makes us begin to feel for Paul and feel for all the things that he's gone through, because not only has he endured incredible physical abuse and all kinds of physical persecution, but now he's really dealing with the emotional abuse and the emotional persecution that crushes his, not just his body, but his spirit, and sends him into a depression. Now he's going to come out of it on the other side, because as he writes to the Corinthian church later, he says, we were pressed but not crushed, persecuted but not abandoned. And so he fully places his hope in Jesus, and he knows that Jesus is going to be the one who guides his life and rescues him. And we even see, as he writes to the Philippians, that he says, to live is Christ, and I would rather be dead and be with Christ, but I think that Christ might just bring me out of this so that I can continue to minister to all of you. And so here this is a really dark time in Paul's life, and yet Christ is still faithful and bringing him through it as he relies on him in his ministry.